So I found a tactic to get my cat out of my shots, which I'm an idiot. All right, I've been a cat owner for like maybe a year now, and I never realized that. So there you go. What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Nick, and I hope that you are having a good day whenever you are watching this video. If not, hopefully this video turns that around for you, because man, oh man, it is going to be a big one for us today. This is going to be a two-part video series that I've been working on now for, I would say, about 2.5 months, probably about 3 by the time you watch this, with editing and everything involved with that as well. But this is a project that I've been very passionate about for the last few months, and one that's definitely been a challenge, but also a lot of fun to put together. This video series is a detailed breakdown on the greatest TV shows of all time, the top 100, in fact. I've tested through a bunch of these different TV shows with a bunch of different factors, a bunch of different categories, and with that, we can finally determine what the greatest TV shows of all time are in an overall rank of 100 up to number 1. Now, a couple things before we get into the video itself, a couple disclaimers that I have. Number one is that this isn't meant to be the most definitive or the most objective. It is a little more scientific, mathematical than some of my other videos, but don't take it super seriously. Like, you know, obviously this is subjective, it's TV, so we're gonna have disagreements on what TV shows ultimately are the best and worst. Number two is that you probably won't love every single show that makes the list. There are probably gonna be a few shows on there that you either never heard of or you're not really that big on. And that's definitely the case for me personally. There's definitely a handful of shows on there that even I am not really the biggest fan of that ultimately made the list relatively high, I might add. And that's totally all right, right? Because again, this is not meant to be the most definitive. This is obviously going to be somewhat subjective. So if you do disagree and you feel like you want to leave a comment, all I ask is that you keep it respectful, you keep it civil, and just be aware of other people's opinions. With that out of the way, let's dive into the video, and I'm gonna start by breaking down how this list came to be. When I started this project back a couple months ago, I knew that the foundation for the list itself was gonna come from a bunch of different sources online, a bunch of other lists that were already made on this topic. I used to do this a lot with music back in the day, where I would take a few different pre-made lists of X band's certain songs, and I would kind of compile them together to get an idea of overall what the best songs were. And I figured that would be a nice structure to use to determine this project as well, at least in the beginning stages. And then once we had our list, then we could go a little bit more in depth with the math and the science behind it. So the first thing I had to do was find a bunch of different lists to take the TV shows from, and for that I chose 25 in total. I knew that I wanted to have a big sample size, a lot of different variety in terms of not only the shows that were going to be on there, but the types of sources that were going to be on there. Not just articles from big publications, but also some smaller ones, some videos, and then some personal lists as well. And I knew that I needed a big sample size to do that, so 25 lists total was the number I chose. 10 of the lists came from big name publications and big online resources such as Rolling Stone, IGN, TV Guide, the Writers Guild of America, Hollywood Reporter. Most of these lists were pretty big in terms of the amount of shows that were included, some as low as only like 45 to 50, but then others as big as 1,000. I knew that I was only going to present 100 total shows ultimately on my list, so for any list that exceeded that, I was just going to cut it at number 100. The second source of these lists came in the form of blogs. I think most people, when they were little, had some sort of an online blog or an online journal that they kept up with somewhat regularly. If it was a Facebook page, a MySpace page, even something like a blogspot domain, that's something that I had way back in the day. And surprisingly enough, there are still a good amount of blogs that are still being active to this day. And a handful of them were very much in the way of entertainment based. So people just discussing their favorite music, their favorite movies, and of course their favorite TV shows. And this was really cool to see because I didn't think that blogs necessarily still were very popular nowadays. I feel like most people have transitioned to something like a YouTube channel, but it was really cool to see some of these still in action. All of the lists that I used for this project will be linked in the description if you want to go and see them for yourself. And the blogs specifically are the ones that I feel like are the most interesting to read, not only because they are obviously one person, so you get an individual perspective on the shows that they're talking about, but also bloggers just seem to have more just natural charisma, natural passion that comes out. And the best example I have of that is from this gentleman here named Dave Wheelroute from medium.com. I used this example because I was really, really inspired by how he wrote about his favorite shows. He did it in a very unique way as well. Over the course of 100 days, he would write 100 different articles based on his top 100 favorite shows. And the more and more he got closer to number one, the longer and more detailed they got. By the time he got to number one, which happened to be The Office, it was a 60-minute article read. The website that he used kind of tracks how long it would take the average reader to read through the article that he wrote. And The Office one, which, like I said, was his number one, was an hour long. And I read through it. It was absolutely amazing. He had so much passion, so much intricate detail as to why he enjoys the way that he does. And I thought that was really, really cool. So if there's one list of the 25 that I recommend the most, it's that one. I'm looking at it right now, and it says actually that he only had 46 followers that would keep up day to day when he would update the list with a new show every day. And that's a bit of a shame because it was really, really good. So go track down his Twitter. I will link it in the description. Go give him a follow because I think he is very, very talented. The next set of lists came in the form of YouTubers, YouTube videos that detailed different YouTubers' favorite TV shows as well. I picked 3 lists for this, mostly because I wanted to pick more, but there were a lot that just weren't going to work for this project. Yeah, so clearly there was definitely going to be a little more research involved with the YouTube side of it because, as you can tell, some of those videos just were not going to work for this. But thankfully, I was able to find 3 that I thought were really solid here from Mike the Ginger, who's a really small channel, Sean Chandler, who's a very big channel, and then Austin Burke, somewhere in the middle. So overall, a nice variety, nice balance there between the 3 YouTubers that I chose. The 4th type was from crowd voting sites such as Ranker.com and TopTens.com that act very similar in how they are structured. I picked 2 lists each from those 2 specifically because those 2 I've used for years and years. And the way that those work is there's usually some sort of a predetermined list based on a moderator or an administrator that will, put together a list that they feel is pretty accurate in their respect. And then they'll have people that come and visit the site, users of the site, up or down vote on those different entries to change the position over time. And as you can tell from some of these particular lists, it's definitely more geared towards the fan favorites, but it's a little more balanced than just one person individually saying their votes. So you kind of get the best of both worlds in that respect, in the form that it is individual people. It's not like the hoity-toity critics of the industry putting together the list. It's still individual fans like you and me, but it's a lot of them. It's a big sample size, so that's how you kind of get the balance there. Some of these lists have well over 1 million votes, upwards of 2 or 3 million. So you definitely know that, again, there's a lot of people voting here. Big sample size, which is what we were after. And then finally, the last 3 lists came in the form of yours truly, Matt, and Mike, putting together our list of our personal favorite TV shows. Now, initially, I didn't want to present a list of myself because I wanted to keep this somewhat objective, but we had used this in a previous video and it worked out pretty good. And I figured it would also be a nice chance to throw in some variety for some individual people. The three of us have definite different views between just the three of us, but also against some of the other bloggers and YouTubers that were on this list as well. And it was a pretty interesting kind of comparison to see which shows specifically we liked, the ones that they liked, and then the ones, again, with that big sample size from the big name publications liked, and then how that would balance out in the final list. So again, the last three from me, Matt, and Mike, and that was our total 25. With that out of the way, I finally had my list of the 25 that I was going to put together for this project. And the next step was pretty simple. It was just taking all of the TV shows from across those 25 lists. Now, in total, that netted us around 1,600 different individual entries, and the total amount of unique shows, that is, shows that appeared at least once within the 25 list collectively, was a total of 576 total shows. Now, again, I was only going to present 100 of these, so that was a lot more than I needed and a lot more than expected. I figured it was probably going to be around 300, maybe 350 at most, because I figured there was going to be a lot of overlap, but it wasn't as much as I was anticipating. So that was a bit of a problem, because to go through 500 plus shows and then only present 100 of them, it just felt like a waste of time. There was a bunch of different tests, a bunch of categories that we had to go through, and going through a bunch of them only to knock, most of them out in the end, not even bother presenting them, just felt like a waste of time to me. So instead, I had to come up with some sort of qualifier to do that. And I figured the easiest way to do that, to have the right balance between shows that deserve to be on there, that a lot of people enjoy, a lot of people put on their list, but also keep out a lot of the filler that was only on one or two of them, was to come up with some sort of benchmark for these shows to hit. X amount of lists and above, you're in. X amount and below, you're out. And that number ended up being 5 lists, so about 20% of the list. So long as you were included on 5 or more, you were eligible for testing. And this ended up working out perfectly, because it knocked out the total amount of shows down from 576 all the way down to 120. That was still a little bit more than I was going to present, but it was actually better that way, because A, I wanted to do some honorable mentions in the overall video anyway, and B, it was still enough to give some sort of a competition to these shows, make sure that they really, really were striving to do well in these tests, and it wasn't just like, as long as you're in the testing phase, then you're on the list, because I did want that bit of competition as well for people to be rooting for their favorites, etc. So that 120 mark ended up working out really well. Side note, the amount of shows that were exactly on 5 lists, so just barely hit the qualifier there, was exactly 20 shows. So if I made it 6, I would have had exactly 100, and then we would have gone through and we could have ranked them from top to bottom. But again, wanted that little bit of excess just to create some more competition and for honorable mentions. Now, that being said, that meant that we had 120 of the greatest TV shows of all time. That's just, a given based on this project. But that also meant that we had 456 shows that did not make the cut. If you want to see the full list of every show that was on at least one list, you can find that in the description, and then the ones that are highlighted were the ones that actually made the cut. But that means that there were still over 400 shows that did not, and before we proceed, I do want to throw out a few of the more notable ones just to give you an idea of how stiff the competition was, that these shows didn't make it, so it's going to be, down to the cream of the crop, but also just to see the variety of shows that were on all of these lists. Some of the shows that didn't make it but were still notable were shows like 13 Reasons Why, Netflix original that's really been popping off the last few years, really, really popular. Third Rock from the Sun, classic 90s sitcom. 8 Simple Rules, 2000 sitcom. We had shows like Adventure Time that were, big with the individual people, the YouTubers, and Matt had it on his list, I believe, as well. And that was also a bit surprising to see that one not make it, but some of the other cartoons made it. We had shows like Alias, sci-fi show, shows like American Dad, again with the cartoon, American Idol, arguably the biggest competition show of all time. Absolutely huge ratings back in the day. One of my personal favorites as well. I have fond memories watching that. Atlanta, show with Childish Gambino, of course, Donald Glover. That's really popular. Another show, Barry, that's come up in the last few years, both on FX there. We had shows like Californication as well, not making it. A couple of those kind of premium cable shows as well. Tons of HBO on our list, of course, as you'll see in part 2, but a couple of them, still unfortunately did not make the cut. One that came really close as well, the Carol Burnett Show, variety show from the 70s that was very big back in the day, as well as Chappelle's Show, not making it as well. All the Chicagos, I believe I was the only one that had those on my list. I'm a big fan of the Chicago shows, but again, that one unfortunately not making the cut either. We did have quite a few anime shows as well. One of the more notable ones, Cowboy Bebop, coming in on 3 lists there, but not enough. Criminal Minds, a huge one that was featured in our drama tournament as well. Fairly Odd Parents, I think that was like on me and maybe Michael's list or something like that. And then a few other shows like that. Family Matters, Family Feud was on there. We had Fetch with Rough Men as part of that as well. The Flintstones, that was one that I was really surprised did not make it. A super influential cartoon from back in the 60s there that only was on 3 total lists out of the 25, which was a bit surprising to me. We also had Gunsmoke in this batch as well. Gunsmoke being the oldest TV show that we saw throughout the course of this list. Started in the 1940s as a radio show, been brought to TV, I believe, in the early 50s, maybe 1950 itself, but it was only on 3 lists, so it did not make it here. Haunting of Hill House, that was one that was on Michael's list in particular, I know. He was a big fan of that, but unfortunately that was on 4 lists, so just barely missing the cut there, excuse me. Impractical Jokers, that one was on 3. I really love that show. That was one of my favorites. King of the Hill only making 1 single list, believe it or not. That was another surprise to me. I thought that one was pretty popular, especially from the adult cartoon sort of sphere, that I figured that one would have a chance at getting on the list. Malcolm in the Middle, that was probably one of the biggest snubs that we had from this project. 4 lists, 1 away from getting into the top 100. I'm sure had it made the testing phase, it definitely would have been in the top 100, but it was just 1 list away. Another example of that, something like Mindhunter as well, hugely popular on Netflix right now. One of their biggest shows as well. My So-Called Life, another huge show from the 90s that got snubbed as well. And then we also had some old school sitcoms that also lost out on the list, such as Newhart. We had Night Court on here. We had The Odd Couple from the 60s as well. We did have tons of classic sitcoms, but there were just so many to pick from that, some of them obviously couldn't make the cut there, which was pretty unfortunate. Here we had Pokemon, we had Prison Break in this that only was on 3 lists there. We did have Oz, though, that made it, which is pretty funny, but of the 2, I think more people prefer Oz overall. Scooby-Doo, another massive cartoon that unfortunately missed the mark there. One of my favorites growing up, so of course I was rooting for it to get on. And then the last one I have for you here, because I've been going over this for a while, so we'll cut it here, is probably, in my opinion, the biggest snub of them all. This drama, I think, is one of the biggest on TV, and I was really surprised that it only made 4 lists, not enough to qualify, and that was Sons of Anarchy. I know my buddy Mike is going to be a bit disappointed in that because he's a big Sons of Anarchy fan. Of course, it was very high on his list, but I guess maybe because it's old, maybe because it ended a while back, maybe that's why. I just figured it was one of the most popular just in terms of like overall perception, but that was yet another one that unfortunately missed the mark here. So again, if you want to see the full list, there's tons more that I didn't have a chance to go over here. You can find that in the description there. With that said though, let's jump into the meat and potatoes of what this video is actually going to be discussing here, which is the top 120 shows that made it into the testing phase going through their respective tests. We had a total of 5 different categories total. You can see on screen now Depending on the category and the significance of it, determine the amount of percent that would be weighed into the overall cumulative score. Here's how that is structured based on the different percents and the different categories that we have involved with this project. For each category, there is a certain amount of tests that each show has to go through in order to make the top 100. That could be anywhere from just 1, it could be upwards of 4, but every show is going to go through every test there. For each test, there will be a score given to each show between 1 and 10. If they do well, they'll get obviously 10. If they do poor, they'll do a 1 there, and then everything in between. There's 2 different ways that we can score the shows for each given test, and it depends on how we actually perform the test itself, but generally, these are the 2 that we used for all of the tests in this project. The first method is the most simple and is the one that we use most often, which is to go through, we take all the shows and we line them up from top to bottom depending on their performance, and then we divide those off into groups of 12, and then each group receives a certain amount of points. The top 12 will get 10 points, the next 12 will get 9, the next 12 will get 8, etc., until we are down to the bottom 12, which will all receive 1. Now, this is used if we have some sort of statistics, some sort of number to use in order to compare all of these shows from top to bottom. Sometimes that isn't available, so that leaves us with the second method, which is to individually gauge how well each of these shows do in that particular category, and then manually score each one from 1 to 10 based on their performance. Now, this would be used if we didn't have a number, but we had some sort of indication based on articles, based on, people's testimonials about how well a show has done in these categories, and then we can manually go through and score them individually. So sometimes there won't be an even number for each, point value with the given test. It might be that more receive 10 points, more receive 1 point. Hypothetically, none could receive 10 if a particular category showed that none of these shows did well, but thankfully that never happened. So overall, there's still a nice balance, but just as a heads up, sometimes you won't see the exact number for each point value for each given test there. I am by no means a statistics guy or a math guy at all, so there was some times where even it was confusing for me. So hopefully as we go through, as we go in a little bit more detail, you can follow through. Hopefully my explanations as well are not too confusing. And with that said, let's jump through each of these different categories. I'm going to throw you the highlights for each test, the top 5 and the bottom 3, as well as anything interesting that we saw throughout the course of it. Maybe some shows that did well that ultimately didn't, that we thought would do bad but actually did good, whatever stood out to me. And let's begin this with popularity here. Now, this is going to be a bit of a controversial category to include because some people would argue that popularity shouldn't be a factor in determining the quality of shows. There are some instances where I do agree with that, but for the most part, I do feel like popularity is important in just determining the shows that people actually know. Because sometimes you have a really, really great show, high quality, very, very funny, or, very good at telling a story, whatever the case is for its genre, but it's super obscure and no one watches it. I think it's harder to convince people that a show like that deserves a higher rank overall for a list when they just don't know how to compare it to shows that they've seen. And that's why popularity is included the way it is, because if a show is just super obscure and no one's watched it, it's just harder to make discourse, to make conversation around that. And then it's harder for me to convince you guys that that show is deserving of a higher placement in the overall top 100. Popularity is worth a fifth of the overall cumulative score, 20%. So it's not like it's crazy unbalanced, like, this is the one category that's super important or anything. But it's enough to give some of these shows a little bit of a boost if they perform really well. Beginning with the IMDb user reviews. This is something we've gone over in a previous video, so this one is pretty straightforward. It's the amount of people that have reviewed the show on IMDb. As simple as it sounds. And for this one, here were the top 5 in order in terms of how many views they had. We had Game of Thrones at number 1 with 1.8 million total reviews. I'm pretty sure that's the highest that we had for any of these shows that I've ever seen, at least. There might be a handful of movies here and there that have a higher review score than Game of Thrones on the website, but in terms of TV, that's definitely the biggest that I've ever seen. Now, doing two of these tests, Game of Thrones certainly has it as number one. Number two was Breaking Bad here with 1.5. Initially, I thought that was going to be the number one because I had heard before that it was the highest on IMDb, but I think that was more the score out of 10, and we'll talk about that later in this video. Number three was The Walking Dead. This is a show that recently me and my girlfriend have been absolutely loving. As far as any of the shows that since the drama tournament that I didn't really know back then, or I hadn't really watched up until now, about a month after, that's the one that I've seen the most of since, and it's been one of my all-time favorites. So you'll definitely hear me talking about The Walking Dead throughout the course of this video because I absolutely love it. Walking Dead, by the way, had 866,000 reviews, which is quite a bit. Stranger Things came in at number 4 with 844,000, and then tied at that, so 4 and 5 together, was Friends with 844,000 as well. Initially, when we did this in the first video, Friends actually had the number one spot. It's actually gone up in reviews since then a little bit, which is pretty cool. But here, when we compare it with all these dramas as well, those four come out on top there. Friends falls to number 5. On the other aspect of it, we had these 4 shows all tie for the number 3 lowest. And all of these, as well as the 2 lowest, ultimately all got 1 point there, because again, we're in groups here. So for those 4 shows that all had 7,000 reviews on IMDb, we had Hill Street Blues, The Larry Sanders Show, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and The Rockford Files. Now that is interesting to me because most of those are pretty old shows. That is something that we didn't notice with IMDb, is that the older shows generally just didn't perform as well, which makes sense because it's a newer sort of idea to go online and stuff. Old people that really like those shows probably aren't going to be doing that all that often. But then you have stuff like the Larry Sanders Show down there. Maybe it's just more of an obscure show. It's an HBO show from the 90s that was really popular back then. So it's a little bit surprising to see it down here, but ultimately that is how these sort of bottom shows ended up. And then below then at number 119 overall, so second to last here, was the Bob Newhart Show, another really old sitcom there from the 70s with 5,000. And then coming in at dead last here, the lowest ranked show for the IMDb reviews was The Honeymooners with 4,000 reviews. Again, The Honeymooners, super old, black and white from the 50s, right? We already know that that's sort of the pattern that we can see with IMDb here. In terms of most of these shows, they pretty much performed how we would expect. There wasn't really any big surprises there, but it did seem like, again, the older shows versus the newer shows, that was really the takeaway here for the IMDb user reviews. Let's move on to the ratings graph user reviews. This website is very similar to IMDb in many ways, but is a bit different in terms of how it actually reviews its shows. IMDb, you review the show out of 10, and that's the review. There isn't any sort of, algorithm it has to go through or anything like that in order to present the number. It's just the total amount of people that have clicked, 1 to 10 stars, and that's it. But with Ratings Graph, they do it a little bit differently. Each individual episode you can review from 1 to 10. You can do that on IMDb as well, but with Ratings Graph, it's actually more important because it's the total number of reviews between each episode added up together. So let's say that, a show has 10 different episodes and they all have 20,000 reviews. That would give you a total of 200,000 reviews for Ratings Graph. It's not necessarily, the amount of people that have read the show specifically, but the episodes involved. So the one pattern that was a big takeaway here was if a show has more episodes, generally it did better here in comparison to ones that have less. But that wasn't always the case. There was still a bit of a difference throughout the overall rank that we saw. Coming in at number 1 here was Game of Thrones, once again, with 3.6 million reviews on Ratings Graph, again, based on the episodes, and they have 8 seasons worth of episodes, so it makes sense. That was over double what we saw on IMDb, which is pretty insane. Number 2 was The Walking Dead this time, 1.4 million. Number 3 was Breaking Bad, 1.3 million. Number 4 was The Simpsons here with just over 1 million, which is good. And that one overall had the most amount of episodes. So again, it makes sense that would be here in the top 5. And then rounding out our top 5 again here was Friends. So like I said, very, very similar to IMDb. The only show not making it this time was Stranger Things overall, and that's just because, again, it doesn't have as many episodes. That ultimately got 9 points out of 10. It was in the second group that we saw underneath there. On the opposite end here, again, a very similar result overall. It was generally older shows that did poorer here. Coming in third to last here, 118 was The Larry Sanders Show, once again, 8,000 reviews. The Honeymooners was second to last this time with 6,000, and then coming in at number 120 here on ratings graph was Roots with just 1,000 reviews. Now, Roots is not only a very old show, but it's also the show, I believe, with the lowest amount of episodes. It only has 8 episodes total. It was only a mini-series, so it's technically only a one-season show, similar to like a Freaks and Geeks, for instance. But Roots in particular is also old, so that's why you get the imbalance there. And it's very interesting to me because even though it was extremely popular, we're going to talk about that in just a second, when it first aired, it feels like almost nobody has gone back and rewatched it. Like, when's the last time you heard someone talk about Roots, you know what I mean? The original series from the 70s, that is. So again, not really any major surprises here on ratings graph. Overall, pretty much what we expected here, aside from, again, the lower amount of episodes, the lower the rank generally. Now let's talk about the big boy when it comes to popularity, the Nielsen ranks. You guys know, if you've seen the previous video, that this one is super important to the overall popularity test, and this one was worth 60% of the overall vote within the popularity category, so this was going to make or break some of these shows. For this one, there wasn't really a pattern generally. It was just kind of luck, honestly, for some of these shows. But you could probably infer, for the most part, that if a show had less competition when it first aired, that was generally a better indication that it was going to do well here. One other major thing that we noticed here, which is going to piss some people off, but it's just how the math worked out, is for a lot of the high-profile dramas and the premium cable dramas, to where they have just a general less audience than network shows, they just didn't really do that well here, guys. So we're talking shows like your Better Call Sauls, your Breaking Bads, True Detective, Dexter's, things like that. Those are not really the best result for the Nielsen ratings in comparison to shows that had a much wider universal audience when they first aired. So that's just kind of how the pattern worked out. And as a result of that, coming in at number 1 this time was I Love Lucy. Now, these 4 numbers that you see next to each show, what those all represent in order are A, the average rating, the second one is the peak rating, the third is the first season rating, and then the last one is the last season rating. And we use those last 3 in order to determine any ties that we had, to break any ties going in descending order there. For I Love Lucy, it came in with a average of number 1 and a peak at number 1. For its 4 seasons, it was number 1 for its 6 seasons, it was number 1 for 4 of them, and it came in the top 3 for every season it was on air for. It was the only show to break in that high. Number 2 was The Cosby Show here. That came in at number 1 during our other video where we did this with just sitcoms. I Love Lucy we didn't include in that video, but it was instead The Cosby Show. This one had an average of 4, a peak at number 1, and a first season of 3. Now, when it comes to The Cosby Show, some people are going to have their reservations in praising it in any ways, and I totally understand that. But you got to remember that back in the day, The Cosby Show was just simply so freaking big. Like, there was almost nobody that wasn't watching this damn show. Hugely influential, not only for sitcoms, but TV in general. It just captured an audience unlike you would see anything today do. There were obviously some things going on behind the scenes that we weren't aware of, but in terms of just taking it at face value, that's the numbers that we got. That's where it ranks. Coming in at number 3 here was The Andy Griffith Show, another super old sitcom from the 60s. coming in with an average of 4, a peak at 1, and a first season at 4, so just barely under The Cosby Show. I believe that one was one that ranked in the top 10 for every season, so makes sense that that one would come in our top 5 here. Number 4 was Friends this time, average of 4, peak at 1, and a first season of 8. So you see those last 3 all very, very close, with those first couple stats there being determined based on the first season. And then finally at number 5 here, Home Improvement, an average of 6, peak at 2, and a first season of 4. Generally speaking, like I said, it was definitely network shows that carried overall in this list, because the rest of the top 10 were all network shows. We had Roseanne, All in the Family, MASH, The Golden Girls, and ER round out our top 10 there. But everything in that top group that earned 10 points was a sitcom there, so that was pretty interesting to see. Also, side note here, I found out in the research of this video that All in the Family and The Cosby Show are actually the only 2 shows that hold a world record in regards to their Nielsen ratings. They both peaked at number 1 consecutively for 5 years in a row, back to back to back to back to back like that, which is really cool to see. Again, with The Cosby Show, you know, maybe you don't want to hear something like that in regards to it, but I still thought that was pretty cool that they both hold a world record in that. Now, on the opposite end of the scale here, for the ones that we had stats for to test, these 3 came in at our bottom 3 here, all earning 1 point. We had Girls, which is an HBO show that had a average of 171 and a peak at 151. Then we had The Leftovers here, average of 171 and a peak of 163. And then finally, our last place show here, 4 ones that we actually had numbers for, was The Americans. 175 average, 140 peak. Now, those last 3, like I said, those are all cable shows, premium cable for Girls there on HBO. And again, those just don't really pick up the same sort of universal audience that you see with network shows, and they're all dramas as well, which is something I said at the beginning of this, that those types of shows generally just don't have the same sort of appeal as the sitcoms do, and as a result, those ended up coming in and the bottom. Now, this was also one of the more interesting categories we had to test, because we also had some shows that we didn't find numbers for in regards to their season ranks. Sometimes with the Nielsen ratings, you know, that tends to happen. Either it's a cable show and they don't really track them for cable all that much, especially if it's an older one from back in the day. Something like The Twilight Zone, it was the oldest show that we had on this list, and didn't have numbers for it. And that's just something that you kind of have to just expect when it comes to these things. It is unfortunate because it's not the most easily comparable, which is why I say, you know, don't take this as the most definitive. You know, I'm just trying to work with what I have here. But unfortunately, sometimes we just couldn't find the proper ranks for them. So instead, there was about 30 to 35 of these shows that we had to manually give a rank to. There were 3 of them that earned a 10 out of 10 here, so we'll go over those first. Number 1 was Roots here with, of course, 10 out of 10 there. The biggest factor into giving that was, for its time, it was the most viewed show on TV. In the top 100 most viewed broadcasts of all time, like we're talking like not just TV shows, but things like, you know, the moon landing, for instance. Things like, you know, sports, like the Super Bowl and stuff like that. Like in the top 10 TV broadcasts of all time, or the top 100 TV broadcasts, every episode of Roots ranks on that list, meaning that every single one was viewed by, at the very least, like 70, 80 million people, you know? I think the one reason it doesn't have a rank for it in comparison to some of the other shows from back then is because it was a mini-series. Maybe they didn't see it in the same way. And it was also interesting because instead of airing weekly, it aired daily. So for like 2 weeks, it aired, you know, a new episode each day, which is a bit different than how most of these other shows aired. So that's probably why we didn't have the same numbers for it. But like I said, over 80 million people watching every single episode, like those numbers are just unheard of now. In terms of just general numbers, that is the overall top show. But since we didn't have the ranks to compare them, we had to put it in the second group here. So as a result, of course, it earned the top score there with 10 out of 10. The second one that earned 10 out of 10 was SpongeBob here. That's pretty self-explanatory. In looking at the Nickelodeon shows by comparison, SpongeBob consistently came in the top for its season and its demographics on its channel. There were some times where SpongeBob would outrank any show that aired on network TV that same day, which is insane when you consider that SpongeBob is, generally a kid's show, so many adults probably aren't watching it, and that it's a cable show, so again, it doesn't have the same audience, and it was still able to outrank several shows consistently the way it did. So 10 out of 10 for that. And then the last one we have here is Stranger Things, 10 out of 10. This is easily one of the most popular Netflix shows at the time, easily ranking in their top tier in terms of popularity, in terms of people watching. I couldn't find any direct numbers in terms of like how many people are watching, but just from everything that I've heard and every article that I've read on this topic, it seems as though that is consistently being one of the most popular. Each time they drop a new season, it'll be consistently viewed every time a new season drops for a longer period than most Netflix shows do. So, and that makes sense considering, it's freaking Stranger Things, for goodness sake. So, naturally that one, of course, is going to rank very high. Now, in terms of these shows that we didn't have a rank for, that we had to manually look at, there was only one example of a show that came in with a 1 out of 10 here. This show in particular overall would have probably had the lowest score of any of them, like Roots would have had the top one, but since we didn't have any, hard-hitting statistics, we couldn't rank it, we couldn't compare it to any of the other shows. But that show has a pretty notorious backstory in terms of its Nielsen ranks and just how, poor it did in terms of viewership when it initially aired. If you're already part of the community, if you already know, kind of the history of this show, then you probably already know what I'm referring to. But for those who don't, we're talking about HBO's The Wire. Now, of course, many, many, many people would consider it one of the greatest TV shows of all time. Of course, that's why we're talking about it in this video as such. But when it comes to the Nielsen ranks, this is a sight to behold all on its own. It is probably one of the most notorious just instances of a show where the quality, the critical reception, crazy high when it comes to just how passionate the people were watching this, how much they enjoyed it, but the very, very, very few people that were actually doing that. Like I said, I couldn't find any hard-hitting statistics. HBO has never publicly released them. It seems to be a pretty popular kind of mystery in regards to its community. I actually found a Reddit post in searching this topic asking if anyone had the actual initial Nielsen ratings on for The Wire, because it seems to be one of those shows that just has a big fan base nowadays that wants to see, how well it did back in the day. The story reportedly goes that by season 2, the quality had dipped, and that is definitely something that I think most people who even really, really like The Wire can agree on, that season 2, definitely not the best. So even the people that really supported it were slowly fading out from the viewership there, and it was so bad that HBO threatened to cancel it after season 2, which, could you just imagine a world in which that happened, where The Wire didn't have the rest of its run on HBO? That would be pretty insane, if you ask me. But with that said, the creator of the show thankfully was able to convince HBO that it was worth renewing for a third season, and then the viewership and the quality slowly picked back up to where it was able to complete its run all the way till 2006. But that overall was still not enough to really do much in terms of making it a big success like other shows that we've seen, such as The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, that slowly started with, a pretty small audience, but then slowly ticked up because of its quality. A lot of the main accolades and, lists that came out regarding it as one of the best shows definitely came later, much, much later, well after its initial run. So it took a long time for people to really discover how good The Wire really is. And as a result of that, the initial viewership, the initial ratings, gives it a 1 out of 10 here, because very, very few people were on that train when it first aired. The last test we have in terms of popularity here in regards to these shows with this project was its social media presence. Now, this one was really interesting to test because we had 3 different sites that we used. We gave them each a score from 1 to 10 for each of those sites, and then we averaged them out overall to give a score from 1 to 10 that we would use for the cumulative score regarding its social media. So for this, I'm going to go through the 3 sites that we did, and then we'll look at the overall scores. So the first site we had was Facebook. I picked Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit for this because I figured they would each give a different sort of demographic, a different viewership. Facebook generally older, Instagram generally younger, Reddit somewhere in the middle, but generally, different types of people that will flock to those different sites. And with Facebook, it was definitely shows that were seemingly very popular with that crowd, but in a very unique way. And I'll explain it in just a minute. Coming in at number 1 here was The Simpsons. We gauged this based on the amount of likes that the official Facebook page for these shows had, and that one had 60 million likes on Facebook, which obviously makes sense. It's the friggin' Simpsons, There was no question that that one easily deserved the number 1 spot there. Number 2 was Spongebob with 51 million likes. Number 3 was Family Guy with 45 million likes. Number 4 was South Park with 41.2 million likes. I think you can see a pattern here. And number 5 was House with 36 million. Definitely a bit of a black sheep there in our top 5. Now, what I mean by say those demographics would generally pick those shows, but in a different way, I feel like it's generally considered that the longest running shows definitely seem to be the ones that most people on Facebook really enjoyed, because the rest of our top 10 looked like The Walking Dead, which has gone on now for 10 seasons. We had shows like Game of Thrones in there, which was 8 seasons. How I Met Your Mother was in there with 9 seasons. Friends was in there. Those all scored 10 out of 10 on Facebook. And again, I think it's because of the fact that those shows were just super long running, that they had a lot of time to, kind of build up this audience on social media as it was going on. But the one other factor that I really think really helps some of these shows on Facebook specifically is the rise of Facebook in comparison to when the show debuted. There were some examples that earned a 10 out of 10 here that you really would not expect to see. And the biggest of them all was iCarly here with 24 million Facebook likes. That was over Game of Thrones, How I Met Your Mother, and Friends that all got 10 out of 10, but that one ended up beating all of them out. And that even beat out some of the other shows that scored under 10 out of 10 that easily could have gotten up there, like Dexter, Breaking Bad, The Office, Stranger Things, Modern Family, SNL. Like, there were so many shows that it was under. Even Drake and Josh it was under, which is funny as hell to me. Drake and Josh was actually 9 out of 10 on Facebook. It scored 9.1 million. And again, it was over shows like Lost and Modern Family and stuff like that. So those two in particular, I think because, again, the rise of Facebook kind of coincided with when those were popular on TV. Again, around 2006, 2007, when Drake and Josh was ending and iCarly was starting. So you kind of had that overlap there, which I thought was really interesting, considering so. And then another example of that could be something like Futurama, also up here with just under 25 million, which also ranked in our top 10. And again, that was around the time when it sort of transitioned from Fox to Comedy Central, so it had that big, leap over to another network, and that gave it a lot of buzz, of course. So again, kind of coinciding with Facebook's rise there. On the opposite end of the scale, we had a total of 8 shows that did not have a Facebook page whatsoever, so naturally those all scored in the 1 out of 10 category, and those were The Larry Sanders Show, Bob Newhart Show, Taxi, The Office UK, Monty Python Flying Circus, Louie, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and Cheers, surprisingly, did not have a Facebook page, which that was really interesting. Now, these were all really old shows that I figured, the people of Facebook would generally have an interest in, but I think they were so old that the people behind these shows, the companies, the production companies, just didn't bother to make a Facebook page because they were just so old that it didn't really seem worth it in the end to make a page for like Taxi, just because it's just such a weird, kind of show to have included on social media there. But as for the shows that we did have a page for that we could compare numbers, these three ended up being the bottom. We had Columbo with 16,000, The Mary Tyler Moore Show with 9.5 thousand, so 9,500, and then Hill Street Blues with a little over 2,000 likes. So that one ended up coming in last of all the shows that we did have a page for, like I said. And again, those are all three that are very old as well, so probably not a lot of traction to those in terms of that they're not on air right now. They just don't have a lot of buzz regarding them, so naturally they're going to come in at last place. Let's move over to Instagram now. Now, going into this, I figured that Instagram would work generally the same way. We just go over to the official page for these shows on Instagram and grab the follower count. But what I quickly realized was a lot more of these shows did not have a Instagram page than they did a Facebook page. It probably would have been well over 20 or 30 shows that we would have had to give a 1 out of 10 to, and I just didn't really feel like that was fair because a lot of these shows really should have had a page on Instagram. They were shows like How I Met Your Mother, for instance, was one no official Instagram page, which is really surprising to me. And then, of course, we had, all those older shows as well that didn't have one. So I just didn't think that was super fair to those shows. So instead what we did was we used the Instagram search feature to determine how many hashtags a show had instead. And that is how we used the numbers to compare here for Instagram specifically. The amount of hashtags determined based on the show's title there. Should be more clear. So in that case, number one here was Game of Thrones this time, 13.5 million hashtags on Instagram. Number two was Stranger Things, 13.3 million. Spongebob came in at number three here, 8.4 million. The Walking Dead had just over 8 million, and Doctor Who rounded out our top five here, bit different, with 7.1 million. I guess there is kind of a pattern there, or just like general shows that are popular. That's really all I can say for those. There isn't really like something specific with those five that ties them all together, not like Facebook where it was all like long running cartoons like we saw, but on here just kind of more general, a general feeling that those shows would do well. On the opposite end, this time we didn't have any shows that didn't have hashtags because naturally they wouldn't, which helped, but some of these shows definitely could bump up their hashtags game a little bit. These three in particular. We had Homeland with 205 hashtags on Instagram. We had Home Improvement with 151 hashtags, and Happy Days came in last place with 35 hashtags. I'm just so surprised that like they even had like a number at all, because 35 hashtags, like that's how many people are watching Happy Days. I just thought that was pretty funny. Lastly, let's talk about Reddit here. This one was pretty simple. We just go to the official subreddit, grab the follower count, simple as that. Number one, once again, was Game of Thrones here, 2.8 million on Reddit. Rick and Morty came in at number two, 2.2 million for Reddit. The Office US had 1.7 million, that was at number three. Walking Dead once again showed up in our top five, 1.5 million on Reddit. And Breaking Bad also having 1.5 million, a little bit over, so breaking the tie there. But again, same point value, so didn't really matter too much. And those were our top five there. For those five, I would probably argue that those are like, very passionate fan bases. Definitely something like Breaking Bad, definitely something like The Office. I will probably go on record by the end of this and say that The Office has the most dedicated fan base of any show, like just period. And of course, being in the top three of Reddit, that totally makes sense. Game of Thrones at number one, I definitely see that. Obviously a big fan base, but also Game of Thrones is one of those shows that has a lot of little subtle things to it that you really want to pay attention to. You really want to, those little subliminal things that Redditors just love to break down and analyze. So that definitely seems like the type of show that would top the Reddit list specifically. And once again on Reddit, we had a handful of shows that we didn't have a page for. We had 6 this time, those being The Honeymooners, All in the Family, The Cosby Show, naturally enough, Roots, Taxi, and The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Again, all very old sitcoms and older shows that just aren't really popular in the age of the internet there. But as for the shows that did have a Reddit page, these three came in last place. We actually had a tie for third to last here between Happy Days and 24, surprisingly. Only 63 followers on these. I might add that these last few have some of the loneliest Reddit pages I've ever seen. It's like one guy that's actively asking people to like just post in general because there's nobody posting and they have like less than 100 followers. It is really something to see. Second to last here was the Dick Van Dyke Show, 61 followers, and coming in last place for Reddit was The Daily Show with only 27 followers. Before we move on to the critical reception, which is the next test that we're going to go over, I do want to throw out the top 3 shows that did the best overall for the popularity test, which were in order. Stranger Things at number 1 there. Again, that makes sense. It was pretty much top 5 across the board there. It had huge Nielsen ratings, definitely helped us when it came to that, putting itself at number 1 there. Number 2 was Friends, same kind of idea there. And number 3 was Spongebob there, which is really cool to see. I know many of you are probably rooting for Spongebob to do well overall in this project, as am I. So to see it do well in the popularity test like that, 2 thumbs up for sure. If you want to see any of the individual categories and all the stats and all the shows that ranked from top to bottom on your own, all of that will be linked in the description if you want to go give that a look. But as of now, let's continue on with the critical reception. All right, let's move on to the critical reception. Now, this is probably going to be the one that I think most people out there that would disagree with popularity being there, this is probably going to be like the one that they see as the most important there. They're both weighed the same, so just so you guys know. But yes, the critical reception obviously very important here. Last time we did this, we used 3 different sites. We used IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, and Metacritic. This time around, we're doing 4 different sites, all weighed at 25% each, and those will be IMDb, Ratings Graph, TV.com, and Rotten Tomatoes. I was going to do Metacritic initially, but again, kind of similar to some of the other things that we saw earlier in this test, there were just a lot of shows that surprisingly didn't have any page for Metacritic, and that was going to be a bit of a problem. Again, we couldn't have an excess of like 20 or 30 shows not have a score for that. So unfortunately, we had to substitute that one, and instead we have TV.com, which is new this time, and that is one that's a little more obscure. It's a little more centralized with a very small group, but it did bring us some scores here, so that was important to the overall test. Let's begin with IMDb here, probably the most popular of these sites that we're using for this category, and coming in at number 1 there was Breaking Bad. Like I said before, Breaking Bad has the number 1 score on IMDb in terms of its critical score, 9.5 out of 10 there, which is the highest on any TV show, I believe. Again, maybe a couple movies, maybe a handful that have a higher score in terms of the overall, amount of things that are on IMDb. But in terms of TV specifically, Breaking Bad for sure takes the cake there. Number 2 was Band of Brothers this time, 9.4 out of 10. Another mini-series similar to Roots that was on HBO in 2001. We haven't really talked about it much yet because it's not really super popular, but definitely within the critical sphere, you'll definitely hear its name be brought up. Number 3 was Game of Thrones here, 9.3 out of 10, as you can see a pattern forming there. Number 4 was The Wire, also with 9.3. And then number 5 here overall was Rick and Morty with 9.2. If you're curious how we broke the ties here, we did it the same way as last time, the amount of user reviews in comparison to the score. Because we also had Sopranos and Avatar The Last Airbender also get 9.2 out of 10. But in the top 5 specifically, it was Rick and Morty because it had more user reviews. Overall with IMDb, you definitely saw that there were general kind of like collections formed with certain scores. Like generally between, 8.9 and like 8.3-ish, maybe 8.4, definitely had the bulk of this show. So somewhere within the middle of the eights, which is pretty strong for most of these. Last time around, we saw the lowest score of any of them was a 5.5, and thankfully we didn't get that low this time. That was with the Cleveland show, if I'm correct. But this time around, the lowest three scores were the following. We had Roseanne with 7.0 in third to last place there, 118. We had Full House with a 6.7 out of 10. And finally, coming in dead last here on IMDb was iCarly with a 6.6 out of 10. Going into this, obviously iCarly, in comparison to a lot of these other shows, probably isn't going to do all that great, you know, compared to obviously something like Breaking Bad, for instance. Like, it's just no competition there. But it is a little disappointing to see it that low. It would have been nice to see it at least in the 7s, and then Full House again, 6.7 there. But like I said, thankfully it wasn't super low. 6.6 is still, you know, a decent score. I'm not saying it's like, you know, best of all time, but it's definitely better than 5.5, which is the lowest that I've ever seen for a TV show. So let's move on to ratings graph now. Now, very similarly to how we tested it for popularity, it's not necessarily about the show as a whole, but more about the individual episodes. Each episode is rated on a scale 1 to 10 from its users, and then it's the average of all those episodes put together. So this time around, it was Band of Brothers that came in at number 1 with a 9.1 out of 10. Breaking Bad was number 2 with 9.0. Daredevil on Netflix was number 3 with 9.0 as well. Better Call Saul was number 4 with 8.9, and Sherlock ran at number 5 here with 8.9 as well. Again, breaking the tie there based on the amount of reviews as well. And this time around, seeing a different number 1 here was really cool. Band of Brothers, it has a very small episode count, only 10 total episodes for the show. But because it was so consistent and it was so great throughout its run of those 10 episodes, it actually had the highest score here on a ratings graph, which is really cool to see. All right, moving on to the bottom 3 for ratings graph here. We had Full House once again here with a 7.0. This time around, Saturday Night Live with a 6.5 out of 10 at second to last here, 119. And then our last place show here, The Daily Show, with 6.2 out of 10. I can definitely see why all 3 of these shows are down here the way they are. I mean, Full House has never really been huge when it comes to critics or audiences, really, for that matter, quality-wise. And it was, you know, bottom 3 on IMDb as well, so that makes sense. And then SNL and The Daily Show, of all of the shows we have tested, are the 2 with the most amount of episodes. So again, it's that consistency that, you know, has kind of gone up and down throughout the course of it. Also, they've been on for many, many, many years. So as you can tell, you know, not every show or not every episode is going to be a 10 out of 10 there. But to see it that low is kind of surprising to me, both under what the lowest iCarly was on IMDb there in terms of their score. So a little disappointing there. Next up, let's take a look at TV.com. This is probably the most obscure of all the sites that we're using for this particular segment of the project here, and it's definitely the one that I was the least familiar with going into it. It did look like it was a very small but passionate group of people, both critics and audiences again, that really, really liked you know, these TV shows, but not very many of them on the site. We did take the amount of user reviews again for each of these shows in order to assess tiebreakers, and the one that had the most was Lost this time, but it was only 47,000 reviews total, which was much, much lower than anything on either Ratings Graph or IMDb. So again, not the biggest community, but certainly one of the most passionate. Coming in at number 1 here overall was Rick and Morty this time with a 9.3 out of 10. Again, all of these based on 10 there, so pretty easy to compare. Number 2 was House this time, 9.2 out of 10. Number 3 was Friends with 9.2 as well. Daredevil at number 4 also had 9.2, but again, in descending order of the amount of reviews they had. And then Lost, like I mentioned, was 9.1 here, so it was number 5, and it had the most of any of the ones that were scored 9.1. I would also go on record and say that this one was the most unique in terms of the order that the shows appeared on. Rick and Morty, House, Friends, Daredevil, Lost, those are definitely not necessarily 5 shows that you would expect to be up there. Maybe in the top 10 for a couple of them, like Lost or Rick and Morty, but top 5 and number 1 for Rick and Morty was very surprising to us. We did not see that necessarily. We didn't anticipate it, rather. And for shows like Breaking Bad and The Wire and The Sopranos, they did not really do all that well here. For all the like major big dramas, the top one was Game of Thrones here. It got a 9.0 with 9,000 reviews here, but it only ended up getting an 8 out of 10 overall for the category based on where it was grouped, because again, there were just so many shows that had a higher score over it or more reviews naturally. And then Breaking Bad, 6 Feet Under, The Wire, Twin Peaks, all of those as well in that same category, 8 out of 10 there. Breaking Bad was actually under a handful of shows that we were really surprised by. Right in between it and Game of Thrones was That 70s Show, which is really funny. They all had a 9.0 out of 10, but they had different amounts of reviews. Breaking Bad only had 7,000 reviews, so not too many people watching Breaking Bad on TV.com, surprisingly. And then we also had some interesting placements for The Sopranos, getting a 7 out of 10 overall. It was below shows like The Big Bang Theory and Law & Order SVU, with, again, the same score, 8.9, but less reviews as a whole. However, there were these 3 shows in particular that did the weakest of all of the ones that were on TV.com, starting with Big Little Lies here, 7.3 out of 10. Next up was Brooklyn Nine-Nine with a 7.0 out of 10, and the lowest ranked show to this point here in terms of the score itself, 5.8 out of 10 here, belonged to Veep, HBO sitcom here. That really surprised me because I have always considered Veep one of the best shows in my opinion. I absolutely love it. But on top of that, I've always saw it as a critical darling as well as Brooklyn Nine-Nine. So those 2 in particular being in the bottom 3 like that was really surprising to me. It was really shocking. There were also 2 shows that did not have a page here on TV.com. Those were Fleabag and Louie, and so those naturally also got 1 out of 10 here. But like I said, Brooklyn Nine-Nine and Veep, those 2 really surprised me. Some of the other shows that only got a 1 out of 10 here as well for their overall category score were shows like Modern Family, The Handmaid's Tale, Parks and Rec, and Bob's Burgers was down here. Like, there were a lot of really high-profile sitcoms and shows in general that got that were really good on a lot of the other websites, but not so much this one. So like I said, this one was definitely the most unique in terms of the ordering there, and it was pretty interesting to compare those to places like IMDb, which is a little more mainstream in that regard. Finally, let's take a look at Rotten Tomatoes here. Now, this one is out of 100, so it'll be a little bit different than the other 3. But on top of that, the way that these were sorted was also very unique. When you go to Rotten Tomatoes, generally speaking, most of the shows surprisingly do not have a score initially. It was kind of a similar thing with Metacritic, where I was kind of unsure if we could even use Rotten Tomatoes because a lot of the shows just didn't have a score that we could take to compare. I wasn't necessarily confident that all these shows would have a page for them, but thankfully we found a way around that in the form of a filter called Top Critics. When you go to Rotten Tomatoes, you'll see that they have the critic score and then the audience score, but if you actually click on those and you can see a little bit more in detail, most of the time you'll see a page for Top Critics, which filters the critic score down to whatever the Top Critics is. Now, I'm not 100% sure what exactly it filters out or what it includes, if it's like the most reputable critics, if it's the ones with the highest score, if it's the ones with the most amount of like prestige. I don't really know how they filter it, but what I do know is that for a lot of the shows that initially don't have one, that are just, empty, it does give you a score for that. So that is how all of these were filtered for this particular rank. Was through the Top Critics tab. And as a result, we have a very unique order for Rotten Tomatoes as well with this method. Coming in at number 1 here was The Muppet Show. That one was the only show to get a perfect score for not only the critics and the audience score. The audience score is what we use to determine ties, with 100 out of 100 for both scores there. Number 2 was Avatar: The Last Airbender, 100% critics and 99 audience. I Love Lucy came in at number 3 here, 100% critics and 98 audience. Then we had Gravity Falls at number 4 here, 100% for critics and 97 audience. And rounding out our top 5 was Freaks and Geeks here, 100% for critics and 96 audience there. You can see the pattern very, very well formed there. What was also very interesting about the top critics filter is that it gave a lot of shows 100 out of 100 as a result there. And this included some shows that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see get that high of a score here naturally, again, compared to some of the other sites there, but did really well here on Rotten Tomatoes. Some of those shows included ones like Regular Show, Monty Python's Flying Circus, The Wonder Years, Drake and Josh, The Larry Sanders Show, and iCarly once again, which is really interesting. iCarly's been very surprising in this test, I gotta tell you, for some of the ones that it's done really well in. But all of those earned 100 out of 100. So those were all ranked, once again, above shows like Better Call Saul, The Wire, Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, that, again, kind of didn't do as well here on Rotten Tomatoes. Of all of the shows that didn't get 100, the next closest one to it was Better Call Saul with 99 out of 100, and then the one right after that was The Wire with 97 out of 100, so very, very close, but just barely missing the mark there, which I thought was pretty interesting. Looking at the bottom ranked shows, once again, we had 2 shows here that did not have a page, similar to TV.com, those being the Bob Newhart Show and Sesame Street. So even with the top critics filter, those 2 just did not give a score, which was a bit disappointing, but thankfully we got them for the other ones. And very similar to the last time we used Rotten Tomatoes, we had a very interesting result when it came to the highs and the lows there. Rotten Tomatoes is the most extreme, it seems like, of these, giving many, many shows a perfect score out of 100, and also having the lowest scores in terms of its lower side, the bottom 3 here, which all scored under 5.8, which was the lowest that we had previously from TV.com. Those were Home Improvement with a 54% for critics, Full House once again with a 50% coming in second to last, and then also Happy Days this time with a 50% coming in dead last there. Happy Days did not have an audience score, which is kind of weird. Some of these actually did not have an audience score, so naturally in the tiebreakers they were lower. So that's why you see Full House above there like that. Overall, for the critics' scores, we had these 5 shows perform the best overall. We had Avatar: The Last Airbender, Rick and Morty, Breaking Bad, The Wire, and Freaks and Geeks. Those ones were definitely the biggest when it came to this particular category, and overall that would obviously help them later on in the list itself. What I also want to note here about the critical reception, and something that ties into the general sort of thesis of the entire project here, is that every single one had a different number 1 show. We had Breaking Bad, Rick and Morty, Band of Brothers, and The Muppet Show all get a top score for their respective sites there. And that, again, just goes to show you how subjective TV really is, that all of these different sites with very different methods, with similar methods, but very different results as a result of that, all having a different top show, which I thought was really, really interesting. Let's move on to the longevity category. Now, this one was one of the newer ones we had that was not featured last time, and this is a measure of essentially how important the show has been over time, right? How popular it's been, the quality-wise, how it's been over time, and kind of a measure of, in the future, will it stay that way, right? And how important it'll be over time. For this one, there were 2 different categories we had, 2 different tests. The first one was the age of the show in comparison to its list percentile. The list percentile is its own measure when we do the list rank category a little bit later. But basically what that is the average sort of placement it had amongst the 25 lists that we initially used for this project. And then comparing that to the age of the show, the older shows versus the newer shows, and kind of seeing if the older shows did really well amongst the placement of the list, they would get a higher score. If the newer shows did well amongst the placement, they would get a decent score, but they would obviously be hindered because they're newer shows. And then if the older shows didn't do as well overall on the list, then again, it would kind of balance itself out there. So what we were really looking for was any older shows that did really well and any newer shows that did poorly there that would indicate that they don't really have any longevity as of right now, right? Maybe that'll change in the future, but as of making this, they just don't have much. And then the second one that we used for this was the syndication distribution. This is a measure of kind of the reruns of shows if you've ever seen on like cable or your local syndicated channels as well that just play reruns. How often they're playing these shows, and then as well if they're actually getting people to watch these shows in reruns. Let's start with the age versus the percentile. This was going to be worth 70% of the overall longevity score, so this one was important. And for this one, we took the two averages, and then that was the overall score. So for instance here, for The Twilight Zone, which ended up being our #1 show this time around, it had a 10 out of 10 for its age. It was one of the oldest shows on the list, as well as a 10 out of 10 for the percentile. It was one of the highest ranked amongst the 25 initial lists. So naturally that one was the only show that got a 10 out of 10 here. We had a handful of shows that had 9.5 out of 10, which were I Love Lucy, Star Trek, All in the Family, and Cheers. So either they were, they had a 9 in either the age or the percentile, and then they had a 10 on the other one, naturally, so they had 9.5 overall. And those 5 ended up being our top tier shows for this particular test. Twilight Zone, I Love Lucy, Star Trek, All in the Family, and Cheers. And again, you can tell that, obviously the older shows kind of getting a little bit of a push here in this particular category, as they should, because again, they have the longevity, they've been around for longer. But these in particular also did really well amongst the initial list. So they have, again, the best of both worlds there. On the opposite end, the bottom 3 shows that did the worst in this category all were definitely the newer shows. And again, that definitely shows you that these ones just do not have the best when it comes to the longevity side of it. The Handmaid's Tale coming in at third to last here as an example of that, as it is the newest show that actually made the testing phase here, debuting back in 2017. So the most recent of them all. And again, it's a great show, don't get us wrong. It's definitely deserving of being here, but it's just too new to really argue that it has any sort of longevity, that it's, been out for years and years in comparison to all these other shows. Maybe it will in the future, maybe, they'll start playing reruns and stuff so that future generations can enjoy it as well. But as of now, it's only been a few years, so they just don't really have much in the way of that. Very similarly, American Crime Story and Big Little Lies both averaged out to a 1 here, so they had the lowest ranks on both the percentile and the age there, those debuting in 2017, 2016 there. So again, very, very recent shows that just don't really have much in the way of this particular category. Maybe that'll change in the future, but as of now, that's just how it is. Going to the syndication test, this was worth 30% of the overall category. And this one was also a bit different in how we actually did it. For most of these shows, the reasons why they would either do well or bad for syndication specifically were usually very similar to one another. If they were good, it was because they were aired on multiple different stations daily and people were watching them. If they were bad, they weren't airing at all. So for the most part, they were generally collected within the same point values pretty, consistently here. For this particular test, we used these 5 different point values. Depending on how good they were, they would end up in one of these different camps, and they would obviously receive the amount of points that they were determined to. So for this one, they were either 10 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 6 out of 10, 4 out of 10, or 1 out of 10. For the 10 out of 10s, it was generally sitcoms that did the best here. We're talking shows like I Love Lucy, All in the Family, Happy Days, Cheers, Golden Girls, Married with Children, Full House, The Simpsons, Seinfeld, Fresh Prince, Friends, Frasier, That 70s Show, Family Guy, How I Met Your Mother, Big Bang Theory, Parks and Rec, Modern Family, Futurama. I mean, those were the shows that topped the charts here. We had huge numbers when it came to the amount of stations they were playing, even worldwide for sure. A lot of these shows get syndicated in other countries as well, and then people watching them as well. The Big Bang Theory in particular, when it came to the sitcoms, generally had the highest ranks that we saw, and that was actually from the Nielsen company themselves. They do track syndication, and those numbers came directly from their website there that you're seeing on screen now. For the Big Bang Theory, and again, huge numbers, especially when syndication. That is topping some of the shows that we saw in the Nielsen ratings on their initial debut. It had more in reruns, so Big Bang Theory easily deserved to be up here. And then for dramas, the only drama show that was up in that same tier as the Big Bang Theory from the Nielsen company themselves was Law & Order SVU, actually, one of the most syndicated dramas. We did have a handful of them, but they were definitely much less than the sitcoms. It was either the Star Trek shows, so the original and Next Generation, and then the 2 Law & Order shows we had up here as well. Those are the only 4 dramas to get the 10 out of 10 here for syndication. Next up was the 8 out of 10s. Now these ones, they definitely did have a lot of stations they were playing on, and they were relatively popular, but either just not as much in either one of those 2 categories, or they just haven't done it in a while. Maybe they were taken off air at some point, and it's just more inconsistent when they're actually on. And this was a much better mix between both dramas and sitcoms. We had Friday Night Lights, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Gilmore Girls, 30 Rock, Scrubs, South Park, Home Improvement, The Honeymooners, MASH, Doctor Who, Spongebob, Avatar, BoJack Horseman. There was a nice variety of all these different shows. You can also tell that this is the first time we're seeing cable shows in here. For any cable shows that get reran a lot on their respective network, like, daily reruns, then they ended up in the 8 out of 10. So that's why you see shows like South Park on here. For Comedy Central, it's one of their highest rated shows, both when new episodes air and in reruns, so naturally they play it a lot, and as a result it gets really good scores here in syndication. We also saw BoJack Horseman in here, which was another one that was interesting. It's the only Netflix show that had an 8 out of 10 up here, and it's the only Netflix show, to my knowledge, that has actually gotten syndication on other networks outside of it, which is something that Netflix never does. Like, I've never heard of something like that. I didn't think that any streaming show would actually get that. But BoJack Horseman actually did, and they rerun on Comedy Central and some of the international stations as well, which is really cool. For the 6 out of 10s, most of these are ones that either were on cable and do get rerun occasionally, or if they were a network show and they got pulled to other stations, they didn't really perform that well and were eventually taken off the schedule. And these are shows like The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Roseanne, Arrested Development, Sesame Street, The Daily Show, Oz, Curb Your Enthusiasm, iCarly, Gravity Falls, and The Walking Dead. These are more on occasion shows, not ones that you'll see daily, not even weekly, but maybe once in a while they'll replay some of these shows on their respective networks. But for the most part, these ones just don't perform as well when it comes to this particular side of it, in reruns and stuff, compared to some of the other shows in the higher categories. Next is the 4 out of 10s. Now, these are either shows that just recently entered syndication, so they haven't had a lot of time to really process it. Some of the newer shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine and Rick and Morty are in here, as well as shows that either were at some point in syndication and then completely just fell off. Like, they have not been run since. And a big example of that is The Cosby Show. The Cosby Show was huge in syndication because it was one of the highest rated sitcoms, period. But after all of his scandals and stuff, every channel that was replaying it pulled it from their lineup and has never shown it since. So that's another big example. That's one that's in here. Another one that I thought was really interesting from this batch was Dexter. Now, I actually did not know, but Dexter is initially a Showtime show. So it's premium cable, you have to pay extra for it. So a smaller audience. But it was so popular on there that CBS at some point decided that they wanted to play reruns for a much wider audience because they're a network TV channel, and it would obviously bring in a lot more viewers to it. And because Showtime is a subsidy of CBS, so it's kind of like their parent company. And Dexter was one of the few shows that they decided to take a chance on and play on CBS at some point during its initial run. but it actually got stopped because of ratings, because of the TV boards that were like, this is way too inappropriate for network TV. We have to heavily censor this and heavily, kind of edit this down to make it, suitable for a wide scale, release like that. And as a result, nobody watched it because it was just not the same show. They had to change it so much that it just did not work in syndication, and as a result, they haven't really tried since then. So I just thought that was an interesting kind of tidbit for any Dexter fans watching. And then finally, the last ones here, the 1 out of 10s. These are shows that have never had syndication, have never had reruns, and probably never will, or are very, very new that as of right now they do not, but they could in the future. And a good example of that is something like The Good Place. That's a really, really recent show, debuted in 2016. It has enough technically for syndication. It's in 4 seasons, but it just probably isn't going to get there because it's too new. You know what I mean? Like, they already have so many other shows to pick from. I just don't think that it's ever going to get that, level of like, oh, we need to play The Good Place in reruns. But you never know. It's always a chance. But the majority of the 1 out of 10s here were definitely filled up from the dramas here. Definitely dramas that, just don't really apply to the syndication release. They just don't really fit as well as the sitcoms, as well as streaming shows. So we had shows like The Handmaid's Tale, Orange is the New Black, Daredevil on Netflix. Again, a lot of those Netflix shows that just don't really do that well in syndication, as well as big high-profile dramas like Breaking Bad and The Wire and Band of Brothers. Twin Peaks was down here. Again, that just don't really fit with that sort of narrative there. These 7 shows ended up performing the best overall for the longevity category. Seinfeld, The Simpsons, I Love Lucy, Star Trek, Saturday Night Live, Cheers, and All in the Family. Next category to talk about is relevancy, and this one was very easy to test because we only had one single test for it, which was Google Trends. And for this one, I can't really give you a statistic here, but I'm going to show you on screen. These were the top 5 shows by comparison to one another. Those were in order: Game of Thrones, Stranger Things, The Walking Dead, Saturday Night Live, and Spongebob here. SNL was one that I knew going into it was going to do massive numbers here. I figured that had the chance of being number 1 here. You guys know it's one of my all-time favorite shows. I am a big defender of SNL, so I was definitely rooting for it here, and I knew this was the category that it was definitely going to put up numbers for. I am a little bit surprised by Game of Thrones because, to me, I thought when Game of Thrones aired its last season, that was like the one that everyone hated and everyone completely disliked. So I figured after that, there wasn't really a lot of demand to like go back and rewatch it and stuff. And I figured at that point, like, all the demand and all the buzz for it just were completely killed. So I was surprised to see that at number 1, but it makes sense because it's Game of Thrones, everyone was watching that back in the day. And then we had Stranger Things, Walking Dead, and SpongeBob also up there. And again, those make sense, generally popular. We saw earlier in this video again, so that totally rings true here as well. On the lower side, we had these 3 as the lowest shows here. Those were Fawlty Towers, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and Monty Python's Flying Circus. Very, very old shows, again, from the 70s, 60s, 50s there, that generally just are not very relevant or not very popular nowadays. And just like last time as well, I'm going to give you this graph here, which is the top-rated show, Game of Thrones, the lowest-rated, Monty Python, and then the one that was the most in the middle there, which happened to be the Twilight Zone this time here. That one got a 6 out of 10. It was the lowest rated for 6 out of 10, so right in the middle there. And you can see compared there, Game of Thrones way off the charts there, as you can tell. That was really interesting as well when looking at the trends for Google, because Game of Thrones was so freaking big that it basically just like zeroed out everything else it was compared to, aside from Stranger Things, Walking Dead, and Saturday Night Live. Those were the only other 3 that could even like register on the chart alongside Game of Thrones, because that's how big it was. The last category we have to talk about here in this video is the list rank. For this, we took the 25 initial lists and we used them in a couple different ways. The percentile, which we already talked about, the average placement overall for the shows here, and then the amount of lists that it was on as well, so the quantity by comparison there. I went back and forth with how much each of these should be weighed in terms of this category, but we ended up settling on 60-40, a little bit more towards the average placement, the percentile, because we figure overall, it's about the placement more than the amount of lists. You could be on 20 out of 25 lists, but if you're always ranked in the bottom 10, it's not going to be as well off in the overall top 100. So we figured percentile was a little more important there. And speaking of percentile, these were the top 5 shows to do the best here. Number 1 was Game of Thrones here, which had an average of 90.5, meaning it was generally always in the top 10, maybe a couple exceptions here, but generally 90% of all the other shows were below it on the list. That is huge, easily one of the top tiers in regards to the overall rank that it had within the list there. Number 2 was The Sopranos with 90, so just right under, kind of the same idea there with The Sopranos. Number 3 was The Wire with 86.9, so about 87% of shows would be below it there. Breaking Bad came in at number 4 here, 86.5, so around 86 there. And then Spongebob rounded out our top 5 here once again, 84.6. Spongebob, of those top 5 shows, were definitely on the lowest amount of lists, the least amount in comparison to all those massive dramas, but it overall did really well in terms of the list that it was on, relatively ranking high, usually within the top 15. The only list that it was below, I believe, like 80% was Mike's list, actually. It came in at like 60 or something, which was the lowest, which by comparison is really good, because even still it was in the top half of the list, so that even still was very, very good to see for a show like SpongeBob. On the opposite end, these 3 had the lowest ranks when it came to the percentile. The third to last here, 118, was The Good Wife with an average of 25.2%, so generally in the bottom fourth, the bottom quarter of the list. Oz came in second to last here with 20.9, about 21%. Side note here, Oz in particular was a really interesting show to track for the initial list, because it had the most amount of entries where it was the lowest ranked show that was still on the list. So usually like exactly number 100, you know what I mean? Or exactly 50, wherever it was. So it was always, it was generally on the list, but it was usually the lowest ranked one that it could possibly be. So to see it here in the bottom 3 is really no surprise, but I just thought it was pretty interesting. I think it was like at least half of the entries that it was on was like the lowest ranked one. And then the lowest overall for the percentile was American Crime Story here with 20.6, so just under there with Oz as well. For the amount of lists, there was only one that had over 20 total entries here, 21 out of 25, well over 80% of the list it was featured on, and that was Breaking Bad here. The only 4 lists that it was not featured on were all from like individual people. Not necessarily the big publications. Those all had Breaking Bad on it, but it was more just a personal choice, from the individual lists as well, from the bloggers and people like that. Seinfeld and Friends tied for number 2 here with 18 overall. We used the percentile to break the ties here. So Seinfeld technically had a little bit more, but those were both on 18 of the 25. And then the next 3, The Office, Lost, and Parks and Rec, all had 17 list placements. So nothing else that was really up to Breaking Bad standards with the 20. Nothing else broke over 20 lists, but still a very, very high percentage of the total list there for those shows. Like I said earlier, there were exactly 20 shows that had the 5 lists needed to be in the testing phase there, so the minimum required. But these 3 also had the lowest percentile in comparison, and those were Home Improvement, The Good Wife, and American Crime Story. All in all, when it came to the list rank, we had these 7 shows that got a 10 out of 10 for both percentile and quantity, and those were Seinfeld, The Simpsons, Game of Thrones, Sopranos, Breaking Bad, The Wire, and Mad Men. The list rank overall was the most important category. It was worth 30% of the overall cumulative score. So those 7 shows in particular were definitely going to get a big boost in that regard. However, there was still one more burning question left for this project, and that was, where did the top 100 shows end up here? What was the order? which ones came in at the top, what was the #1 show, and which 20 ultimately did not make the cut here. All of those questions will be answered in part 2 of this video series. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. I know it was a lot of information to break down, so I appreciate you sticking with me here. Be sure to share this video out, give it a like, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. We're gonna get this bad boy up to over 100 views. I already know it because this series is definitely one of my favorites. Part 2 is coming very, very soon. So thank you guys again for watching, and we will see you then. Bye. Really.